much. So obviously we're still awaiting the next draft text, but we've been very involved in negotiations throughout the week and a half now. And I think that one thing that's important to say is that for a really long time now, climate negotiations have sort of shallowly referred to justice and equity without operationalizing it, much like Avantika was saying about the finance question. This is one of the reasons why we have this sort of stalemate and delay that we've rallied against as civil society year on year. We see political polarization not just between nation states affecting multilateralism, but also emerging within societies, and the lack of trust, sort of broken promises, is part of this. But as a cross-constituency movement, CAN is a large network representing over 2,000 organisations in 130 countries, but we've also worked across all of the constituencies with workers, feminists, young people, indigenous peoples, on a simple call to action to parties to actually operationalise justice in global climate governance. So we called on them to come to Belem and agree to a new mechanism on just transition, which would enable just transition both globally between countries and locally within countries. And we've called that the Bélem Action Mechanism, or the BAM. If you don't have your pin, which says BAM, let us know, we'll get you one. This just transition implementation mechanism, it's not just an idea, it's actually a fully fleshed out proposal that we've worked on all year. We've worked on across constituencies with practitioners who've implemented just transitions within their context, and also with parties. So it's been, really a new sort of breakthrough in how non-party stakeholders and party stakeholders can work together on moving forward from discourse to implementation. The scientists reminded us yesterday in their statement that the global curve of emissions needs to bend next year, so 2026, not sometime in the future. We need to start right now to reduce emissions from fossil fuels by at least 5% a year. We believe that the ban will be critical to making that a reality. We need to transition away from fossil fuels in a just, equitable and orderly way, as parties agreed to under the GST outcome. I obviously work for the Fossil Fuel Treaty, I deeply believe in that, and we all know that doing this requires support for nations across the global south to make this a reality. We really believe that the transition away from fossil fuels roadmap that's being discussed will need the Bélem Action Mechanism to stand a real chance of succeeding. So the Just Transition text, which should be the spine of the Multilateral package, could be a real breakthrough. So imagine for the first time at COP, parties are considering a single, ambitious proposal capable of coordinating action across the UN system, bringing coherence on different areas that are working on just transition in different ways, strengthening cooperation, offering technical assistance, and importantly, bringing knowledge from the ground in countries across the world on how you do just inclusion, how you do cooperation, how do you make just transitions work. So this will put justice and inclusion at the centre and not on the sidelines for the first time in an operational way. So it demonstrates that we can work together across not just constituencies and parties at keeping 1.5 degrees alive. And in the negotiating rooms, this idea or a just transition mechanism was put forward by the G77 in China early last week, and there was a snowball effect of blocks across the global south getting behind this idea because they also believe and have worked with us to develop this idea out that it's necessary to enable the transition away from fossil fuels and whole of society transformations, which is what we need, right, to leave nobody behind, not just between states but within them. So the challenge that we've had all week is a lack of ambition from a number of states and parties across the global north, asking why do we need this, and it's been very, very clear from parties across the south why we need this. We need the coordination, we need the support, we need the knowledge exchange from parties in the south, and we also need to start to mend the broken trust by 1 or 2 steps forward from the north. And this is not a huge commitment in terms of making a proposal around an action mechanism. This is pulling together lots of work that's already being done in a much more coordinated and effective way. So as we enter the critical phase of the negotiations, we must defend and complete this step forward. The time is now for parties to lock in this progress and push hard to ensure that all elements of the Bélem Action Mechanism land in the final deal. So it's really important that parties that have been blocking this across the global north, and as a British person, I'm speaking to the UK as well on this, that we need to push past the stalemate that exists only from a small number of parties absolutely crucial to a people-centered, just structure moving forward. And now is the moment to secure that and fight for the elements that will make it deliver. Thank you.
And now we're going to hear from Pooja on adaptation and why indicators are not enough as they are being presented now. Over to you, Pooja.
Thank you so much, Danni. Good morning, everyone. And as my colleague previously said, that while we are waiting for the draft text to appear, let's not forget where we are. We are in Amazon. It is the best fitted background to talk about the issue that has been neglected or only talked in silence for years, and that is climate change adaptation. For those communities at the front line, for the vulnerable communities, adaptation is not a choice, but it's their only option, and it is their right and right to survival. And yes, in these spaces, adaptation has always been treated as a secondary issue while we talked about emission reduction. But we are nowhere near to limiting the temperature goal to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so climate change is not a distant reality, but it is something that many communities are facing every day, and they are not left with anything but adaptation to cope up with this impact. So if COP30 really wants to deliver a justice package for those communities on the front line, then they must urgently adopt a new adaptation finance goal, a goal that is public, grant-based, provisional, predictable, and it is from developed countries to developing countries, and it needs to be at least 120 billion by 2030. We need to understand that without finance and without means of implementation, adaptation is incomplete. 10 years ago, in Paris, we agreed on a global goal on adaptation, a goal that was considered to be equivalent to 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. And yet, even after 10 years, that goal has not been operationalized. Indicators that are the mere framework or important backbone of that goal are yet not ready. And yet, over here, we are told that please adopt indicators first and then we will talk about finance. How are we supposed to adopt indicators if they are not ready, if they are not fit for purpose, if they are not at that level where they can tell you the story on adaptation? They are the metrics, they are the measurement tool on adaptation. They will tell you if adaptation is happening, if it is happening in the right direction or not. And currently, those indicators are missing means of implementation. Instead of having concrete indicators on means of implementation which are balanced, which talks about provision of finance, which talks about capacity building, which talks about technology transfer, what we have are options. In fact, what we have are indicators that talk about private finance, ODA, national budget, and they are not in line with the principle of Paris Agreement and Convention. So if we really want to agree on an outcome over here, on an outcome on indicators, if we really want to see those indicators being adopted, first, please make them fit for purpose and then back them with finance, because the framework on global goal on adaptation is hollow without finance, and that really needs to reflect the needs of the vulnerable community. If this COP really wants to be successful on adaptation, it will only be if there is a new adaptation finance goal. And let's remember, over the years we have been told that adaptation is complex and technical. Who has done that? That's developed countries. In adaptation rules, we are told that this is not a space to talk about finance. Who are those? Those are developed countries. And lastly, if those indicators that tells you the story of adaptation are not backed by finance, then that is also because of developed countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Pooja. And we're just going to keep a little bit of finance going and hear from Avantika on the ambition gap of finance.
Thank you. So what we have been hearing here in the corridors from many developed country parties, media colleagues, and other sources is that the NDC ambition gap is really becoming the sticking point for developed countries. And so much so that it is being treated as the condition based on which they will move ahead on any other item, be it the just transition mechanism, be it tripling of adaptation finance flows. And the reality is that, I just want to clarify, developed countries don't really have a clear goalpost in mind for this, as has become very evident from all of our conversations through this entire week. They have constantly reiterated that they want more ambition and more new NDCs and better at NDCs, whilst themselves not putting up pledges that are in line with their fair share. Now, if we talk about who's really taking climate leadership in the world today, it's not the developed countries, it's not the Western economies, many of whom the largest historical polluter has exited the Paris Agreement. Many other developed countries, the European Union, Australia, Japan, they are massively entrenched in fossil fuel use, consumption and production as well for many of them. So they are not leaders on climate action today. So if we want to talk about actual ambition, what we actually see is leadership coming from the global south. So today, 51% of solar power globally is produced by BRICS countries. In the first half of 2025, fossil fuel power actually rose in the US and the EU, while fossil-based generation plateaued and declined slightly for China and India. The reasons were more structural for China, of course. And of course, speaking of China, we are seeing China being a leader, not just in putting out a conservative NDC, but also leading on the production and deployment of clean technologies globally. We have India that has just announced that its NDC is imminent and upcoming. So major economies who are always in the spotlight, Indonesia, South Africa, they have all published new NDCs. And we have to remind everyone that this is despite the complete mistrust and lack of hope in the process as was precipitated last year in Baku. So developing countries are committed to climate multilateralism. They are doing their part on NDC ambition. So this argument that we need more ambition for developed countries to play their part, I'm calling complete nonsense on that. And we have to dispel that. We will see a lot of scapegoating in the coming days, particularly of major emitters, which is a made-up term. Large developing economies will be put in the spotlight for not doing their part, not putting up ambitious NDCs, and that will be the argument that will be used to hold back adaptation finance for the entire African continent, for NDCs, for SIDS. It will be the argument that will be used to hold back a just transition mechanism that is being fought for by people, by communities, by trade unions. So let's all remember this argument is completely bogus and we should not fall for it.
Thank you. Wise words. Now we'll go to questions. Please say your name and organization. Fourth row, please.
Can you hear me? Pooja from Le Monde. Can we have your reaction to the arrangements for COP31? And do you have any details on how it landed? Thank you.
We'll take another question.
Hi, morning, Avantika from Carbon Brief. A question for Amiera on the Just Transition Work Programme. How different is the EU's action plan they put forward to the Bélem Action Mechanism? Because there does seem to be some overlap, but without the sort of impetus for actual movement within it. So I wondered, what are the overlapping bits, and are we seeing any movements from the EU or from the UK that look like there might be some flexibility and then lead towards an institutional mechanism?
Amiera will take that question and then we'll come to COP31 response.
So I think the key differences between the EU action plan and the mechanism is that the action plan is less ambitious in terms of highlighting how action should be coordinated within the UNFCCC. So the action plan is more about mapping and understanding what just transition initiatives exist, which we already know because we've done that as civil society and constituencies. It removes references to financing the transition. Ultimately, we're not calling for a fund under the Just Transition Mechanism, but what we are calling for is an acknowledgement cooperation is there's oversight, and that this is evaluated against key principles, which we've also put forward as civil society, including justice, equity, ensuring that the transition is financed and so on. So I would say it's a less ambitious proposal, and the other sticking point is really the notion of an observer seat at the table, which we think is absolutely critical. Why? We've demonstrated all year what we bring to this question, but also so many observers are actively involved in those whole of society transformations that need to happen. Governments need people to make transition happen, and so that's another key sticking point. Thanks.
And then on COP31, essentially regardless of location, Australia has to show leadership and focus in climate action. It has to deliver on full ambition of the Paris Agreement, even while the climate summit is hosted in Turkey. And that includes mapping long-standing specific demands like just and equitable phase out of fossil fuels, complying with Australia's legal obligations to prevent climate harm, and committing to new, predictable and accessible ground-based climate finance. Any other questions? Back row, please.
Thank you. I'm Hannah and I'm from Emory University. There's two questions. One, is there any major decisions that you're anticipating from the high-level dialogue on adaptation that's happening today? Second is a bit overarching question. We have a very growing emphasis on adaptation. Is it any way distracting away from, or undermining the mitigation efforts, particularly in terms of transitioning away from fossil fuels? Because in my mind, I feel like for developed countries, it would be an easier pathway to look at adaptation than mitigation.
Thank you for that question. On the Baku high-level dialogue, as you know, it's a dialogue where you exchange and share views. So you will not get a concrete outcome from a dialogue, but you will surely hear that how developing countries are demanding that adaptation is really a center pillar in this process, that adaptation finance is really delivered. So that is likely what will happen at the Baku high-level dialogue later today. Shall I take this question as well? And on your second question, yes, very rightly, but this space has always talked about mitigation. And there is no way that we talk about adaptation and we will not talk about mitigation. We need to talk about both. And in fact, we need to talk about all the three pillars of Paris Agreement, that is adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage. So talking on either of the other or prioritizing either of the other about the next one is not undermining the later one. We will continue to talk about mitigation, and currently after forced GST, NDCs are your mechanism. Things need to happen back at national level as well. While on adaptation, things are happening at national level, but the means of implementation, that is the support pillar for adaptation, is not getting provided, and that needs to come from developed to developing, and this is the space where we need to ask for that, and that is why we are putting adaptation as the top priority.
And fourth row, final question.
Hi, I'm Claudia from Media. I wanted to know what did you think about the EU's proposal for the fossil fuel roadmap, and are any other proposals on this from other groups and countries? And also, what do you think about in this EU proposal that's looking about I think this is meeting of high-level meetings and reports. What is this going to do to
Sorry, I just wanted to make sure I understood your question properly. So obviously the conversation around the transition away from fossil fuels is very much welcome. We're really happy that that is on the agenda here and is being discussed. I think what has happened in general when you look at northern blocs is they have sort of held the line on this question in their conversations with nations across the global south, that they need to show that they're going to transition away from fossil fuels. But as Avantika rightly outlined earlier, there is a little bit of hypocrisy in how that conversation is delivered, especially under specific negotiating mandates. So this maintain text on the transition away from fossil fuels without any text on financing and technical support. So it's really important that what is happening and discussed in the action agenda, which is not mandated, is fairly reflected in the negotiating spaces, and that involves not cherry picking parts of the GST outcome as a kind of political tool to blame the Global South. Many of those nations in the Global South are not able to access fair financing to transition away from fossil fuels, whereas nations in the Global North are, Norway is a great example, other members of the EU, like they're still investing in fossil fuels in the Global South themselves, for example through LNG expansion in Africa, so that they can continue consuming fossil fuels while continuing to blame countries in the Global South. So for us it's really important to highlight that what's being discussed in the action agenda can't be a sort of cherry-picking political tool to point fingers in the negotiating room and not actually address the real structural issues that we're expected to develop outcomes on.
And that's a wrap. Thank you very much. As the new text drops, Climate Action Network will of course be providing analysis. We'll more than likely have a press huddle right outside the media centre, so dear journalists, you don't have to stretch your legs too much. So just